Thank you very much, Stephanie, and welcome everyone to the Institute of Coaching's monthly webinar series. And good evening, or good morning, as Stephanie said, or good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. I'm greeting you in the evening from New York City, and we are truly doing a global webinar this evening with Suzi Skinner, who is all the way down under, and I think it's actually early morning for Suzi, so good morning to Suzi. We are very excited to have Suzi with us today because it's always an honor to bring our keynote speakers and track speakers from our Harvard conference back to have them have an opportunity to reprise and deepen the talk that they give at our annual conference. And Suzi was one of our most loved speakers at the conference last September, so it's an honor to have her back with us today. I'm going to just give a brief introduction of Suzi's background and then turn the webinar over to her, and she will share with us her presentation about leader identity and executive coaching. And all throughout the presentation, I want to encourage everyone to use, as Stephanie said, use the chat function and write to me, or write to us, I should say, and share with us your questions, anything that's unclear. We will pause at various times during the webinar to take questions, and I will pass on the questions to Suzi as I get them. We'll hopefully have a few minutes at the end to have a dialogue between our listeners and myself and Suzi, so we'll try to do our best to get to as many questions as possible. I will say, however, that it often happens that we run out of time because we get into a deep conversation. And so if we don't get to all of the questions and we don't reach your question, please feel free to contact me or Suzi directly so that you can be sure to get your question answered. Sometimes people want us to also follow up and just repeat something that Suzi said or share a resource. So don't hesitate if you didn't get your question answered to write to us. You can write to me at jeff.hull@instituteofcoaching.org, and we will make sure to give out Suzi's contact information before the end. So with that, let me just introduce Suzi and turn it over to her. Suzi Skinner is an author, a researcher, a leadership practitioner, and managing director of a boutique consultancy in Sydney, Australia called Roar People. Suzi works with organizations to transform leadership, accelerate change toward more inclusive workplaces, and enhance employee engagement and results. Her compelling approach combines the proven evidence base of leadership and executive coaching with fresh perspectives on tapping into the leadership potential of every individual. Suzi coaches and facilitates at executive and board level in a range of leading international organizations. She runs innovative programs, for example, one titled What's Your Leadership ID, which has been conducted in Europe, Asia, and Australia. Suzi is also, we are honored to say, a Harnish Scholar, having received a grant from the Institute of Coaching for her research titled Understanding the Importance of Leadership Identity and Gender in Developing Women Leaders. She was awarded the first prize for her academic poster at the Institute of Coaching Annual Conference in 2012, and as I said, she was one of our keynote speakers last year. As a recipient of the Institute of Coaching Research Grant, she studied and explored developmental practices such as executive coaching with women and provided fresh insights into these key areas for leaders in the workplace. Her research was then published in a peer-reviewed academic journal called Coaching, an International Journal of Theory, Research, and Practice in 2014. And then her book on this subject was published in 2015 called Build Your Leader Identity, a practical guide to leading authentically from any position. Her website is www.roarpeople.com.au, and I'm sure that her book is available on Amazon and wherever you happen to be doing your book shopping from around the world. So we are thrilled to have Suzi with us tonight, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending upon where you are around the globe. And I want to now turn it over to Suzi and welcome her to our webinar. Hi, Suzi.
Hi, Jeff. And hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and a big thanks to Jeff and Stephanie for pulling all of this together so beautifully. I also wanted to take a moment to thank the Institute as well. As you can hear from Jeff's introduction, I've spent a lot of time with the Institute, and last year's presentation was a real highlight of that work and that research. So I'm very grateful to Carol and Susan and the team for their support of my work. So as you may be able to tell with my Australian accent, I am also suffering from a terrible cold, and you may need to excuse me at certain times in the presentation if I need to mute myself to have a cough. So please forgive me for that. The other thing I'd like to say is that I know webinars are always a bit tricky, but if you do have questions as I go along, I am more than happy to take those and to engage in conversations throughout the presentation. So as you can see from my first slide, I want to spend some time talking to you about leader identity and to distinguish that between a knowledge and a doing focus that I'm sure many of your clients, like my clients, are very focused on, the skills and knowledge that their people need to develop, which is very real. But rather focus on the being of leadership. So helping our clients to recognize the leader qualities that they already have and the leader that they are already being as they show up. So this is an emerging area around leader identity. There is a lot of research now coming out of various areas to show that leaders who have greater clarity on their leader identity, so their self-concept as a leader, have been shown to have greater levels of resilience, more likely to be promoted, and experience career longevity and well-being. So I'm going to take you through a taster of some of that research and some of the ways I think as coaches this approach can complement what we're already doing. In one way, I think that a leader identity approach is another developmental avenue that you can explore with your clients. It doesn't replace all the good tools that are out there and the very powerful approaches, but it does take the conversation in a slightly different direction, and it asks you to consider the degree to which your client or you identify as a leader. So we are all made up of multiple identities, whether that's being a daughter, a partner, a best friend, a manager, and a leader identity approach fundamentally asks, is leadership or seeing yourself as a leader one of those identities that you would describe yourself as? So let me take you through that. As Jeff was saying, this is research that I did through the Institute, and you can see in Jeff's introduction that it originated from my interest in developmental challenges for women, and that work was fundamentally focused on understanding when women are engaged in executive coaching, which was the sample group that I worked with, what was it that they were working on? So developmentally, what was the commonalities that were coming through? So they all had different backgrounds, different levels of experience, a whole host of differences. But the fundamental outcome of that research was that regardless of position, title, industry, background, they were all to some degree defining or refining their leader identity, how they were showing up, who they were being as a leader in their role. And that work has led me for the last 5 years to really take a deeper dive into the concept of identity, and it draws from literature on professional identity as well as a broader sort of psychological research on identity itself. And what the point I want to make is that as you would all know, actually we all go through a process of forming our leader identity, forming and reforming our leader identity. So it's not just a women's thing, it's actually a developmental journey that people can go on. So we now run these programs, as Jeff said, internationally, and the book that I have written around Build Your Leader Identity is really targeting those people that are interested in doing more, maybe stepping into their leader potential, and giving them a whole host of exercises. The book is more of a workbook, I would say, than a book, to really help them step into and understand their own leader identity and help them take ownership for that in a really powerful way. So so I'd encourage you to, please reach out to me if you've got questions on some of those exercises, because today really is a taster session for a much broader approach. So I want to spend just a couple of minutes with you talking about the global context on leadership, and then introducing you to leader identity and talking about how it can complement your coaching practice. One of the things that I think coaches are very aware of as we work with clients in different organizations is the fundamental shift in leadership that's been happening, particularly over the last 15 years or so. It really doesn't matter what industry you're working in. We are seeing leadership being redefined. We are seeing organizations wanting to move away from the old command and control style of leadership and move towards a much more level, accessible, and I suppose in one way attractive definition of leadership, which is really about encouraging and empowering people at every level to take ownership and to lead. So I think from a dismantling of leadership, there's a pretty good understanding around the fact that that needs to happen. There is so much complexity and change in organizations right now that the old hierarchical model just doesn't equip organizations to manage that and to be agile enough to continue to survive and thrive. However, I think what's interesting also is that we also don't have a roadmap to say, how do we tap into the leader potential of everyone? How do we create a leadership mindset that is available to people regardless of position or title? And I'd like to think that this leader identity approach in some way helps individuals take ownership. So in one way it is a pathway or a road forward for individuals to move and to grow as leaders. And I hope that that's more of what I can share with you today. One of the things that researchers are absolutely focused on is the shift in the psychological contract that's been happening. You can see in this slide on the future of work that we've all come from characteristics of what we would call the left-hand side of that slide. So the old contract around expectations of stability, predictability, permanence, paternalism, the organization will look after me, job security, and that idea of one-time learning. And I think obviously what we're seeing more and more of is that shift towards that new contract, the change, the flexible work, and really the self-reliance that context is calling on people to build. Rather than job security, we really are helping our clients to ensure they have employment security, ensuring that they are skilled and looking after their development in such a way that they will have those employment opportunities. And obviously one that I'm very passionate about there is this idea of lifelong learning, and this is absolutely where a leader identity approach fits. One of the key points is that the research shows that we form and reform our leader identity multiple times over our careers. It's not something that we have established as we first started to work in our early 20s, for example, but it is something that represents a sort of a constant developmental journey. So my view is that in this new future of work that is still evolving, we need to help our clients more than ever to understand what it is that they stand for, what it is that they believe in, fundamentally what it is that they want to do in terms of having a positive influence on others and helping them step into that. That seems to be the anchor that they can rely on in this new world. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that buzzword at the moment, the idea of a VUCA world, so volatility, uncertainty, change and ambiguity, really sort of characterizing a lot of the context that we're working with clients within. I think as coaches we have a real opportunity to frame that with our clients as such an opportunity to help them to continue to grow and to evolve and to learn. So more than ever, whether it's at an organizational level or at an individual level, we need people to be making good judgments in this context, to be taking initiative and to be making and sustaining powerful connections. And, you know, this is about at every level of the organization. So I call this leadership at every level. And how do we help our clients value the hierarchy that needs to be in place? So hierarchy needs to be in place because we need order and decision making and all those good things around governance. So that's a very real structure that most organizations work within. But the question is that within that structure, how do we create a culture that allows people to step into their leader potential, regardless of their position, regardless of their age, their gender, their background? How do we help them to take ownership for that in a more powerful way? And I think a key part of that is that my research showed, and not just my research from around the world, is that we are in a time of redefining leadership, that move away from command and control to an encourage and empower mindset actually means that at an individual level we are helping people take ownership for it in their own way. And you can see on this slide, once we get beneath the thousands of leadership models that are out there, and they're all very useful and they have their place, but you know, my thinking is that what sits underneath those models is a commonality, that leadership is fundamentally the positive influence on others. So in that way, it can be as individual as the number of people that you ask. There are no right or wrongs in terms of defining one's leadership, as long as it has that positive influence. And I think that frees up our clients to define leadership in a way that is most meaningful to them, that allows them to authentically have positive influence in the areas that they choose to. And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, there is research to show that high performers, and when I say high performers, I'm not talking just about people that sit at the top of the hierarchy. I'm talking about people that are thriving in their roles, no matter what level of the organization they happen to be in. And it tends to be that those high performers have defined leadership on their own terms. So, you know, for one, it may be that they see leadership is about innovation, and for them they are always the voice challenging the status quo and looking at creative alternatives. For others, it could be that for them leadership is about people. And you know, I had a great session with a client yesterday where he talked about his move into a new organization, and his fundamental leadership identity was grounded in a sense of connectedness, that he was being very conscious and active about connecting with people throughout the organization in a way that not only helped them connect with him, but helped him sustain his own engagement and motivation. So I think part of our role as coaches is to expose our clients to the variety of leadership models that are out there. I know that sometimes we can get wedded to certain models and certain approaches, but I wonder if that's being as best of service to them as we can be. I feel like in this space of redefining leadership, we potentially can offer our clients a smorgasbord of leadership approaches and help them choose what feels most authentic to them. So in a way, taking on a bit of a buzzword at the moment, I feel like our opportunity is to apply a growth mindset to leadership. One of the things that has been a powerful feedback mechanism of this Leadership ID programs that we've been running in, as Jeff said, really in many different locations around the world, is that clients have come to us and said, thank you for not boxing me in. Thank you for not telling me how I should lead. And that leads to a really important premise as well, that from an organizational point of view, there's lots of great work that's been done around leadership competencies and, you know, the way in which organizations want their leaders to show up. And I think, again, our role as coaches is about helping our clients recognize the importance of those competency lists, that those lists represent success indicators, if you like, what it will take for that individual to be successful in that organization. But it doesn't take away from the opportunity at the same time to help our clients define how leadership has been shaped for them over their lifetimes, to help them identify some core aspects of leadership that are meaningful to them. So we talk a lot about redefining leadership as, you know, the power of the and. This is who I am as a leader. My leader identity is grounded in these principles, these values, these life experiences. And at the same time, as I work with this organization, I subscribe to these competencies. I may also see that a number of them align to my own identity. So it's this power of the and. So you're probably wondering by now how we define leader identity, and I really like this definition because it's about the authentic self-expression of who you are as a leader. And it is an umbrella term used to define yourself in your role that includes your personal attributes, your beliefs, your values, your motives, your career, and your life experiences. So once again, this is about opening up leadership in a way that allows people to define it in the way that is most relevant to them and their life experiences, as long as I said earlier that it has a positive influence on others. So two coaching questions that I think are really helpful for our clients is to understand or to ask them, what does leadership mean to you? And even in that first question, you will get different answers based on who you ask, of course. I mean, I know intuitively that's not really a surprise, but it is interesting that even in a team or a seminar-wide environment, you know, with 100 participants, chances are you'll get 100 different answers. And I like to connect that with clients by saying that whatever it is that that person has landed on tends to be representative of their own experience of leadership to date. You know, if leadership is about respecting individual differences or inclusion, 9 times out of 10 that person will have a very powerful experience to share that they've had around inclusion or the lack thereof. And then I think the next question that's really powerful is to ask them, who are you as a leader? You know, if leadership is about the power, the positive influence on others, it actually means that leadership happens anywhere. It can happen at home, it can happen in your community, with your friendships, and your work. So it's a far more encompassing definition of leadership. And we've certainly had lots of examples of people that really start the session with a very different view, that they really don't see themselves as a leader because they don't have the position, they don't have people reporting to them, they don't have the title, all the old characteristics of the command and control, the hierarchical system. But then when you ask them to talk about, well, where are you having that positive influence? The penny tends to drop. And one woman that stays in my mind is a woman in her late 50s who was adamant that leadership was just not part of her repertoire, if you like. It belonged to others. And yet, as she went through this process, she came to see that actually she'd been a single mum looking after her 2 children who are now in their late 20s, both of which were travelling and doing fantastic work internationally, and that actually she'd been leading them her entire life. So that helped her to connect with what was it about leadership that she brought to the table. How was she having that positive influence? So some of the research that I like to quote, some clients find this discussion a little bit fluffy, comes from the Centre for Talent Innovation. This is a study in 2013. And they were able to show a direct link between what we intuitively know to be true, right? That when we empower people to lead from any position, which I think is what coaching is all about, we're actually driving or enabling people taking greater responsibility. It absolutely adds to a culture of inclusion. It strengthens cultural values around collaboration and purpose. And it has very real outcomes in terms of increased initiative taking and productivity and innovation. So their research showed that those organisations that were able to create that culture, they called it a speak-up culture. Here I'm calling it a leadership at every level culture, but it's the same thing, allowing people to step in and have a positive influence. They found that those organisations that did that were 70% more likely to capture a new market in the last 12 months and 45% more likely to improve their market share in the same 12-month period. So in other words, there are very real, tangible, bottom-line benefits, if you like. And one that I would like to share with you that I'm in the process of writing up at the moment is an assignment I did with a manufacturing plant, multinational here based in Australia, where for the last 18 months we have been working with the crews on the manufacturing lines, the crew leaders of the operators on the lines, the asset leaders of the crew leaders, and the senior team in that manufacturing plant, to really open up this idea of leadership at every level, to shift people's mindsets from what is typically a very hierarchical and top-down driven culture, and to help them to create forums for communication and different ways of communicating with one another that showcases their own positive influences, their own leader identity. That's been a very long and, you know, at times challenging process. Asking people to shift mindsets developmentally is a challenge, and then at an organisational level an even greater challenge. However, what we found, so keep in mind this started about 18 months ago, what they have found, and this has been a multi-pronged approach, it hasn't just been, you know, training and development around leadership identity, it's also been supported by very real HR interventions, important stakeholders going on the journey, a whole lot of things within that organisation sort of directed towards tapping into the potential of everyone in that setting. And they have now reported that their results for the last quarter, so the last 3 months, have broken every productivity record they ever held. That actually that manufacturing site is now the most productive it has been in its 25-year history. So obviously I'm excited about that, but I think that for us as coaches and trainers, I think it just speaks to that piece that actually we all recognize and know that every individual has that opportunity or that potential. I think that's why we move into this space. And what's exciting about this work is that helping people, giving people tangible understanding of who they are as a leader seems to open up this sort of freedom around stepping up, stepping in, and engagement, which is very exciting. So a question that I ask when I'm talking to coaches is really, what is the risk in this context if we don't help our clients self-author their leader identity? What are we missing out on? And I hope I sort of alluded to that around engagement and motivation, morale. And then the next question has to be, how do we help them to recognize their own leader identity, to build and to strengthen it? And you would have noticed today, you know, one of the core principles I am working on is that the qualities of leadership actually exist within everyone. They don't belong just to the people at the top of the hierarchy. I think, as we know as coaches, our work with strengths and values and a whole raft of different tools help our clients to see that actually those positive qualities are there. The question is often not, do the qualities exist, but is that individual stepping into their qualities? Are they actually taking the steps to really have that positive influence? So a core part of my research to help answer that question is this idea of leadership identity formation. My research shows that regardless of the person's position, their background, their experience, they all to some degree have been or are going through a process of developing that leader identity. And there were 3 core phases, if you like, or stages that showed up. The first was an underdeveloped leader self-concept. So this showed up in the research very much as people that really didn't see themselves as a leader, that leadership was not something they identified with, and it was something that was external to them, that it belonged to someone else. And then through to the next stage, which were those that were in a stage where I call it a forming leader identity, which is about sort of saying, you know what, yes, I do see myself as a leader, but I'm also conscious of some skills, some practices that I need to develop to continue to build and form that. So you have the identity piece there coupled with that skills focus. And then through to what we call a well-developed leader self-concept, which showed up as, often a very simple statement along the lines of, yes, leadership is just a part of who I am. Now, what's important about this, this formation process is that, as you can see in that model, it's absolutely dependent on context. We don't exist separate to context, as we all know. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it is linked to career success, longevity and resilience. So it makes sense that those people that have a good sense of who they are and what they stand for as a leader are more resilient in the face of change, for example. I think from a developmental point of view as coaches, the opportunity for us is to understand how leadership identity is not static. It's actually very fluid. So an example that I'd like to share with you is a team we were working with recently. It was a VP of sales and his sales team direct reports. And we were taking them through this concept of forming their leader identity, and I asked the VP where he would rate his own. So was he in the underdeveloped, the forming, or the well-developed? Now, let's be clear, it was very likely that he would say he was at the well-developed stage because he was the most senior person in the room, he was the most experienced person in the room, he also had what I call the grey hair factor. So from a stereotypical leadership perspective, he kind of met all the criteria, if you like, for someone that would identify strongly as a leader. And yet what was interesting, and also the other thing I wondered as I asked this question was that I asked it in front of his team. And as we know, some leaders are very embedded in the hierarchical concept of leadership where status is very important. So I wondered whether he would answer, well, of course I'm, this well-developed leader, and where the conversation would go from there. But instead he actually put himself in the underdeveloped area, and you could hear his team like there were gasps around the room. And he went on to explain that perhaps 12 months ago he was feeling very aligned with his leadership and what the context required. He felt well equipped to bring to his role what was needed. But he explained to his team that actually in the 12 months they had gone through so much regulatory change and technology change that he found himself driving home at night time really checking in and sort of questioning, was his leadership the right style of leadership, the right type of leadership for this evolving context? So in a very simple but powerful way, he opened up the conversation with his team to, a level of vulnerability and change that's inherent in people's leader identity, that self-doubt and that opportunity for development is a core part of this process. And that group went on to have some incredible conversations with one another around really supporting each other with where they were at, not judging. This is about, we go through this process multiple times, but really just meeting each other where they were at. And you can see on the slide there, I also think that's a potential for us as coaches, is to meet our clients where they are. Some of the ideas and concepts that we've worked with is particularly in that underdeveloped stage, is about helping our clients redefine their leadership. So again, the research shows that we all have our own mental models, our own schemas in our heads of what leadership should look like. and yet we very rarely reflect on that. We very rarely ask ourselves where those definitions have come from or what has shaped them, and are they the most useful definitions for what is required of us today. So that's a core opportunity as coaches, I think, when we're working with clients in that space. And then clients in that sort of forming identity space is really about reaching out to them around validating the idea that leadership is about trying on new behaviours and attitudes and taking that smorgasbord approach. That doesn't mean that they are losing the authentic part of their identity, but it does mean that we help them to evolve in a way that feels safe and constructive. And then I think the opportunity as coaches for clients we work with in that well-developed space is to, first of all, from a strengths perspective, just help them to recognise that, to validate that, and to do more of it. Particularly, some clients sort of talk about being a very well-developed leader in their work life, but not so much in their private life. So that whole idea of balance. I think another developmental opportunity for coaches with those types of clients is to ensure that that leader self-concept is not too fixed, right? It's about validating that well-integrated identity, but at the same time ensuring that they are also on the lookout for signals and indicators of where they may need to adapt and continue to develop their leadership. Jeff, I wonder if I should pause here for any questions.
Sure. No, it's great. I do have a few questions coming in, and I have a few questions percolating in myself as well.
Great.
So, yeah, thank you so much, and it's a great opportunity maybe for you to grab a quick glass of water or something. You seem to be holding together extremely well. So far, so good.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
I think I'm going to be selfish here and just pop in a question that's percolating for me, and that is that I really love your anecdotes, a couple of examples that you've shared around the leaders that you've worked with and where they see themselves in these stages. And I'm doing a lot of work myself around this same theme, and I call it leader identity. Sometimes I call it post-heroic leadership. There's a lot of different ways of framing it, but in the idea being, of course, that leaders are trying to find their way in this new leadership landscape that you're describing. And I'm curious what you've experienced. You've talked a lot about diversity and different types of leaders around the world, but I'm curious what you've experienced with different demographics, because I wonder if the stages that you have here don't in some ways turn into a circle almost. When you were talking about the gray-haired leader kind of defining himself as an underdeveloped leader, it struck me that at some point he probably saw himself as a well-developed leader, and then it's about sort of shedding that concept and trying on something new. And that maybe younger leaders, the millennials, are more moving from not clear about their leadership concept and then forming their and sort of moving up the chain. So anyway, anything you could share as far as your experiences with different demographics around this process that you're calling leader identity formation would be really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Thank you, Jeff. One of the experience I had recently was with leaders, young leaders, so with some not-for-profit organisations here in Australia and young secondary school, so high school, so they might be 16, 17, 18 years of age, and positioning leadership to them in this way. And certainly what was really interesting, and perhaps it shouldn't be surprising, but in that context, in those sorts of age groups, there's very little opportunity for positional hierarchy, right? Unless you're the school captain or the head of the basketball team. Yet I'd have to say that the feedback from these audiences was so strong. They were so clear about how they were having a positive influence, about seeing themselves as leaders. And I think that's important for shall we say, people in an older demographic to recognize. Certainly I've also had participants say, you know, Susie, you know, these are the millennials and the Gen Y say, well, Susie, this is what we learn at university. You know, this is not new to us. This idea that leadership is you know, is an individual choice, and actually that was really important because in that particular scenario, these Gen Ys were working with their managers, you know, who were older, more experienced, and perhaps far more used to a hierarchical model, and that was the tension between the two generations. So it ended up being, again, a conversation they'd never had around coming to terms with this shifting landscape of leadership and what it could mean for every age group. And I think that that's where a lot of the aha moments happen for teams as well. I think that's when people that are, you know, sort of stuck in a hierarchical kind of mindset really sit back and go, wow, I've never seen that level of engagement from that Gen Y team member. I've never seen them light up. It feels like, in a way, it takes the pressure off the you know, the more senior person, and it seems to free up the younger ones. So it's a really empowering discussion. Does that answer your question, Jeff?
Yeah, no, it definitely gets at it, and I think that's the other reason why I loved your example, because it strikes me that that's perhaps not the norm, having the older, more experienced leader actually share their vulnerability around questioning what is their leadership concept in front of a team.
Yes.
It's a powerful coaching moment that you were, I mean, they were role modeling that possibility of exploring and being open to changing the way they are as a leader. So maybe anything you could add to what a coach could do to help, I hate to use the word old because I think sometimes the same sort of stuckness shows up in young people. I've worked with a 30-year-old CEO who was pretty, he would have considered himself pretty well developed. So I don't know that it's always age related, but
Yes.
To get to that place of being willing to sort of either share vulnerability or open up to the possibility that there are a lot of different ways that they could be leading, anything as a coach that you've seen that's worked.
Yes, love to.
Share that wonderful example.
Yeah, and look, thank you for saying that. I think one of the things I just want to reiterate is your point that it's not just about age, like it's not just about gender. I mean, it really is. People show up in these conversations based on their individual histories, experiences, the people they've worked with, the people they've worked for, their organizational culture. It's such an individual journey. And I think that's why as coaches we are so well positioned to have these conversations, right? Because that's at the core of what we do. So to take your question, Jeff, the next slide, I'm wondering if it's going to move for me, is an example of some questions I think for coaches. One of the exercises that we do, and it's in detail in my book, actually full of exercises, Jeff, for coaches to use. I really did make a conscious decision that there's so much opportunity for these conversations that I wanted to share a lot of the approaches that we take with individuals. So I do encourage people to have a look at that. But one of the exercises is actually based on some research from Murphy. They talk about leadership as a lifespan approach, which absolutely gets to, you know, one of the core elements of identity. We get people to to think back to typically their teenage years, because as I said earlier, childhood and teenage years are the times when you don't have positional authority, right? But the point is that guaranteed that those people would have been having a positive influence on those around them. In other words, they were leading. And what we ask people to do, clients to do, is what was it? What was the story? What were they doing in their childhood or teenage years that had that positive influence? And what leadership characteristics does that reveal in them that they can connect to today? So one example was a young woman who came to Australia. Her parents were from India originally, and they didn't speak very good English, and she was the youngest of 4 children, and her mother got very ill, and she talked about a story in her childhood where even though her English was just as good as her siblings, she decided, or she in that moment sort of stepped up and started negotiating with her mother's doctors around her mother's care. She stepped up, she took ownership, and it was such a formative experience for her, but one of the things that it taught her was about not deferring to authority, was about how this mindset of equality and inclusion can apply in any setting. And it's something that she's now, as a leader today, it's a core part of her identity. Another client spoke about, he spoke about as a teenager, he was the drummer in a band, which is a really interesting sort of, you sort of think, okay, so what's the positive influence? He's entertaining everyone, which is great. But for those that are sort of more musically oriented, he went on to explain that when you are in that position, actually you're responsible for keeping the band together, for keeping everything in time. And so what was really powerful for him was this recognition that actually that's what he's known for today. He's seen as the go-to person in a crisis. He's seen as a really reliable leader who is able to kind of shape the direction. And once again, he's not in necessarily a hierarchical, senior role, but this is how his leadership identity shows up. And the other one I wanted to reflect on was my colleague in India, Shiba Mani, is an amazing leadership coach, and she ran this session for a women's conference in Delhi a couple of months ago. And this is what's so sort of contagious about these conversations is that, in the space of a seminar that goes for an hour and a half, she talked about the fact that she could see the shift. These women were of all ages and different backgrounds, but could see this shift in sort of giving them permission to take ownership and define their leadership in their own way. And one of the things we've reflected on since is that this conversation, I think, gives our clients the opportunity to not be fragmented when it comes to leadership. There's so much sort of expectation around what a leader should look like, particularly I think in Western cultures and organizations. And yet when we help individuals connect to their personal history, to the qualities that were showing up, a long time ago, it seems to bring this wholeness. This idea that they can bring their whole selves to their leadership role, and that feels very exciting. So, Jeff, I'm conscious of time, and I hope that that's helped. One other thing that I think is useful is this next concept of the way in which we as coaches can not only enable and help our clients to strengthen their leader identity, but also I think something that many coaches maybe don't spend enough time on is to really help our clients identify what is derailing them, what is actually getting in their way of showing up or of taking ownership for their leader potential. So my research showed that those derailers fell into a few key categories. So if I just take a minute to talk through that, that might be helpful. But that idea that, a core derailer for clients is obviously navigating an organizational culture. So we talked earlier about, it's not just age or gender. It's very much about understanding what is it in the culture, in the mindsets, in the practices, the processes, if you like, that enable people to step up, and what is it that potentially suppress that initiative taking, as one example. The other classic derailer is that idea of, life and home decisions and how well they are managed by the individual and by the organisation. That idea that if we are working with clients that are just simply overloaded, overwhelmed, time poor, what impact is that going to have on them really taking ownership and stepping into their leader potential? Another one is, which we've alluded to a little bit, those embedded institutional mindsets. So this is where some of the work around the 24/7 mentality that still exists in many organisations, or stereotypes and assumptions that are made for men and women that can either enable or derail their leadership potential. And the last one is obviously, as coaches, the idea of those self-limiting beliefs, the way in which we can self-sabotage or self-define leadership in a way which is not accessible, which limits our own potential. So what, again, we tend to find is really effective as coaches is it's very important to work on the enablers, and that, greater self-awareness, leveraging strengths, exploring values, understanding those stories, and helping people share them. But it's just as valuable to really put a microscope over what's getting in their way, and what challenges are they facing, and helping them to come up with strategies to mitigate those derailers. And the last one that I just wanted to share with everyone is that idea that when it comes to enablers, I think it's a helpful sort of simplification to think about enablers both within ourselves but also within our environment. So this slide captures some of the core enablers in the research, and we've talked a lot about personalizing leadership, really redefining it on your own terms. There's a huge amount of literature out there around achieving authenticity, and part of our role as coaches is to help our clients navigate that, because it can be a minefield, again, depending on where and the context that person is working. And then I think within our environment, one of the core things that really stood out in my research was this idea of connectedness, and I've called it a social resource strategy. But those clients that were really thriving in their roles were so connected, they were so conscious about having this kaleidoscope of support, whether it's a series of mentors inside and outside of the organisation, multiple coaches, peer coaching, teams that they would get involved in, really active around understanding the value that brings to them. And purely from an identity perspective, we know that the wider that social resource strategy is, the more effective that is for the individual. So I think as coaches, our opportunity is to, again, open our clients up to building as much support as they can and as they can make time for. The research shows that when we have that broad connections, I'm not saying they're superficial connections, but different types of resources available to us, we have access to much more variety when it comes to leading, when it comes to behaviours and skills and opportunities to learn. Again, that's pretty intuitive. And the last one, I think, which is an enabler, is that spirit of reciprocity. So we talk to clients a lot about not just taking ownership for their own leader identity, but validating that in others, creating a culture where that equality and that inclusion and that recognition of the leadership qualities is embedded or sort of consciously validated. And obviously that gets to the core of concepts around collaboration. But I think from a leader identity perspective, a key question we ask is that even though the individual may see themselves as a leader, are they prepared to see the qualities in others? Do they have that mindset that's open and willing to validate them? And that often leads to some also very interesting conversations with people. So in terms of adding to the coaching toolkit, I suppose I'm quite passionate about coaches as leader identity ambassadors. I think we're doing that work anyway. I hope that today's session has just given an extra couple of perspectives or lenses that you can take with your clients, particularly helpful around the self-enablers and derailers, really getting clients to go away and do that work for themselves and really dig deeper into that, looking at that from a team perspective. And you know, there's a lot of work on organizational culture, but taking an identity lens to the culture and trying to identify the way in which the culture enables or derails, I think is a great way for coaches to pay attention to those factors when they're coaching with their clients, whether it's one-on-one or as a group. And I think my final slide is just, you know, part of our role. I think fantastic coaches grow awareness into the self and the context, those dynamics. I think we do that. You know, sometimes without realizing it, but I suppose a leader identity approach is asking them to really gain conscious insight into their own beliefs, their principles and stories, and helping them to articulate what's unique about their own qualities, what's unique about that experience, and sort of connecting that in a way that sort of gives that sense of the whole person. And then, you know, from a coaching perspective, really translating that personalized leader identity into their daily work and taking active ownership for that. We've had lots of feedback from clients that, you know, just send a quick email to talk about how they've been able to weave their leader identity into everyday conversations. They might be, you know, recruiting someone, and the person they're recruiting says, well, tell me, you know, what can I expect from you if I take on the role? Well, that's a classic leader identity question. So one woman talked about just pulling out her notes and saying, well, listen, leadership to me is about this, and you can expect this from me. So it's not just a conceptual thing. It has very real positive impact in helping people to connect, helping them to feel authentic, and energizing them as they go about their roles. And as I said at the beginning, I have captured a lot of these individual exercises in my book, Jeff, which you kindly mentioned. And for those that are international on the call, it is available on Amazon as an ebook, and also there's a link there to bookdepository.com where they will ship it to you free of charge. So I hope I have been able to give you a bit of an overview of this area, and happy to take any questions. Thank you, Jeff.
Yay, yeah, thank you so much. Very, very interesting material, and what I love about what you're sharing is the opportunity for coaches to help our clients go a little, as you said, dig deeper into getting to the source of what inspires them and what motivates and empowers them to be able to deal with this kind of crazy, complex VUCA world that we're all trying to find our way through. So I want to thank you for a really rich exploration, and I think it's only fair that we try to get to a couple of questions from the audience because they're coming in. So one question, or a couple of folks are asking about your work with women in particular, because they know that some of the research you did early on was
Yes.
around leadership identity with women. So just maybe a couple of thoughts
Yeah.
around the question is about whether or not women assuming leadership roles is particularly complex, or if there's a certain amount of ambivalence. Any suggestions for coaching women
Yeah.
that are finding their way as leaders, and yeah, I think they're interested in hearing about your exploration of that.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. Yes, look, absolutely. And, you know, like we all know, it depends on the woman and it depends on her background. So a couple of things. In the book, I have purposely woven in a lot of the research specific to women because I have a philosophical belief that you know, those sorts of things should be, men and women should be educated around what those challenges are. So my research definitely, because it was focused on women, highlighted the derailers for women in particular. So you know, at one level, men face derailers as well. I think it's not an oversimplification to say, though, that those derailers can be different and, again, you know, very individual. But certainly the ambivalence for women is absolutely in the way that they are labelling leadership. My research showed that you know, a lot of the women had gone through a process of really sort of recalibrating their own definitions and separating from, as we know in Western cultures, what tend to be very masculine definitions of leadership. So helping them see that and, you know, sort of define it on their own terms is key. Another thing that obviously will show up is around context and helping men and women actually to notice the dominant norms within the teams that they're working within as well. So you know, we know in the literature that when we have an imbalance of, you know, leaders of either gender, that amplifies the way the team norms are established. So I think part of the opportunity is, particularly with women, is one, helping them feel more confident, centered and authentic around their own value that they bring as leaders, and helping them see the value in difference is a key thing. And then at the same time helping team members really notice those dynamics in a way that helps them sort of dismantle them and sort of reset them in a way that is more inclusive. So there are also a lot of examples in the book around you know, different ways that women have done that. There are also examples in the book around different ways that men have done that as well. A lot of men as well talk about those dominant alpha male norms for men are actually very alienating for a lot of men as well. So I think a leader identity discussion helps them see beneath that in a way that's more empowering.
Excellent. Fascinating. I love especially your perspective that there are probably just as many men, I see this every day with my clients, that are struggling with this cultural overlay that's been there for so many centuries around patriarchy and role definition and power. And
Yeah.
it's just as difficult sometimes for men to shift out of that and to shed those sort of layers of armor from their position to as it is for women. And for many men that I work with, women become role models.
That's right.
And that's another opportunity as more and more women just take on roles in senior positions in organizations, and they decide to do it differently. They decide to do it in a way that connects with their own inner sense of identity. Then they become role models for men. So there's a wonderful reciprocity that's available.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
also think that's true of coaching too, right? With a female coach or a male coach. Maybe you could comment on that as a female coach.
So in what way, Jeff? Tell me more about that.
Oh, just as in terms of engaging in this conversation with clients, whether male or female leaders, or even more in terms of diversity. As a woman, entering into a conversation with your clients around this kind of thing. I wonder if you've had experience with whether or not, I know sometimes my clients say to me, oh, I want to have a male coach or I want to have a female coach, and I'm always curious
Yeah.
as to what their thought process is around what that means to them.
Yeah, yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it? Yes. Look, I'm just trying to think that, I don't, my experience has been that I think what you're highlighting, whether it's, they have a preference for men or a female coach, I think it's really important as coaches to, one way to neutralize that, if you like, is about that, really setting that broader context. I
Right.
found that, that it's really important to work with the client on what is happening in their context and what's happening sort of globally and change, because I think that then really makes the idea of resetting or looking at your own leader identity as less confrontational. It's put within a context of, I heard this fantastic quote the other day that I'll share with you, which was along the lines of, managers that aren't prepared to change will be beautifully equipped to manage in a world that no longer exists.
Beautifully spoken.
Right? So
Yeah.
I feel like when we as coaches can sort of open the dialogue that way, because this is very personal stuff, you're absolutely right, and some clients will have a preference for either or, and I think that's fine. This is about sort of acknowledging it and respecting that. But my experience has been that when we can put it in broader terms, at one level we get to depersonalize the process, so then it becomes easier, if you like, for the person to do the work. Does that make sense, Jeff? You're kind of
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
allowing the context to drive the change.
Also, I think what you're pointing to is when you get to identity issues, you're going actually deeper than just whether
Yes,
it's male or female or any other particular type of diversity. You're getting at the core, unique level of what it means to be a human being, which is
that's
sort
right.
of underneath foundational, and exploring that. So absolutely, I think you're pointing at something that's really crucial to helping our clients discover who they really want to be as leaders
Yes,
and what their
yes.
values are. So
And,
I'm
and
sensing,
also, oh, sorry, go on.
no, I'm just, we could probably go on forever, but we have actually reached our time. So
Okay.
just being sensitive to our commitment to folks to stick with an hour and 15 minutes, I want to I didn't get to all the questions, and for those of you that had questions about some other folks' work, we did have some questions, Susie, that came in about Bob Keegan's work, about
Yes.
someone named Joe Raylan. I would just
Uh-huh.
encourage those that had questions about other people's work and how it connects to Susie. If you're okay, Susie, I'm going to just encourage them to write to you, because that you would be able to then take on those questions and make parallels between some of the other research that's been going on, if you're
Absolutely,
comfortable.
more than happy to. And you can hear in my presentation the self-authoring piece is a direct reference to Keegan's work. So yes, more than happy to, Jeff. Thank you.
Great. Super. And then with that, I just want to thank you from the Institute of Coaching. We are honored to have you as a Harnish Scholar and one of our keynote speakers, and thrilled that you were able to spend some time all the way from Australia just starting your day. So we appreciate that. I want to thank everyone for joining us. As Stephanie said at the outset of this webinar, it is being recorded and it will be available to our members on our website within a few days. If you don't see it and you'd like access to the slides or to the recording, just write to Stephanie or myself at the Institute and we will get it to you as soon as possible. And with that, just thank you again, Susie. Thank you all of you who stayed with us in the evening and in the morning, and I wish you all the best. And we'll see you next month. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Good night. Thank you so much, Jeff and
Thanks,
Stephanie.
Susie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.